Eine Ansage, bevor wir loslegen. Ich hätte hier noch eine Teilnehmerliste. Bei uns gibt es ja im Moment im Interim da am Ostend Getränke für Umme. Gegen einen kleinen Eintrag, oh, okay, der Ton funktioniert. Gegen einen kleinen Die Kamera ist da hinten. What I'm doing today. Good evening from Frankfurt. Welcome to our next lecture in our series Neuen Frankfurt meets White City Tel Aviv, or also called Context, Kontrast, Kontinuität. We are in the third season. This is our third episode of the third season. Sounds always good, doesn't it? I'm happy to be here with 5 interesting guests. But first of all, I want to welcome everybody who's here and who's online. We are happy to have the possibility to have this third season of this discussion between preservation, monument protection and urban development. And this is thanks to the funding of the Federal Ministry for Building, Housing and Urban Development, as well as this season by the Freunde des Deutschen Architekturmuseums, by the Friend Association of our museum. So we're lucky to have this. This is, and today we will talk about master plans. My name is Andrea Jürges. I'm the Deputy Director of the German Architecture Museum, and we do this series together with the Ernst-May-Gesellschaft here in Frankfurt and also with the Liebling House in Tel Aviv. So we are really working well together. And also involved is normally ICOMOS, and Docomomo was also involved this time. Master plans. We will have quite a span of years to have a look from different angles on the topic of master plans. Why are they important for any urban development, and how can we proceed today? And I don't want to take too many words right now, because I leave that up to our wonderful presenters. I'll just give a short introduction, just the names, and before each presentation, I will say a bit more about the person and the expert who will talk about his or her topic. We have from the left, it's Eran Meyerson from Tel Aviv. Wonderful that you could come. Then we have Ludwig Korte, short away from this urban development department in Frankfurt. And we have Annika Sellmann from the Ernst-May-Gesellschaft. Then Christoph Packhieser, also from the Urban Development Department in Frankfurt, and all the way from Milan, Chiara Spangaro. All a very warm welcome. And let's get started with the year 1925 and Annika Sellmann. Annika Sellmann studied art history and art pedagogy, I could never say this word without fault in English, and sociology in Frankfurt. She worked at the Museum für Kunst und Gewerbe in Hamburg and also in Bamberg. No, that's where she studied heritage conservation, so she's really an expert on this. She worked at the Museum Angewandte Kunst in Frankfurt, and she's currently also part of the Ernst-May-Gesellschaft, and she will talk about master plans in Frankfurt, 1925. Over to you. And thank you for coming.
Andrea, for the kind introduction. And thank you also to Christina and Philip and the Ernst-May-Gesellschaft for inviting me here today. I'm keen to learn more about contemporary issues of urban planning, and I'm very happy to share with you my view on the New Frankfurt. As you will see, there's more than one way to consider the New Frankfurt a master plan. But let us start with the quite usual two-dimensional representation, a land distribution plan that was published in 1930 by the Frankfurt Housing Authority. Den Klicker brauche ich an irgendeinem Punkt später, ne? Aber noch nicht so bald. We are looking at a late visualization of a master plan for the city of Frankfurt that was conceived in 1925, continuously updated and repeatedly depicted. It serves as a terrific example for a planning scheme from the time that would become the interwar period of the 20th century. It's the time of the Weimar Republic, the first constitutional federal republic of Germany. The plan originates from a program that aimed at an urban reinvention of Frankfurt am Main. Its beginnings can be traced back to 1917, when the Siedlungsamt, Frankfurt's Housing and Settlement Authority, was established by Ludwig Landmann. As the city's Lord Mayor from November 1924, he was setting the framework for the New Frankfurt. The rise of Nazi Germany marks the end of his term of office and the end of the New Frankfurt program too, as many of its key figures had to seek refuge due to political persecution. Let us look at this map. It puts into relation the old town and plots already developed in the greater city area with plots to be developed, industrial areas on the banks of the River Main, open space as well as existing and future permanent allotment garden colonies. Due to the acute housing shortage in Frankfurt am Main, municipal housing construction dominated the building policy. The so-called solution to the housing question had generally become an urgent topic of debate in the 1920s and was put in center of the New Frankfurt development program with a special regard to life just above the poverty line. Our plan was published in 1930, as was this map that gives us a better overview of the new Siedlungen, the residential areas that have been built or prepared to be built from 1925 to 1930. The focal points of urban planning for municipal housing were the Nidda Valley project with the Siedlungen Westhausen, Braunheim, Römerstadt in Heddernheim and Höhenblick in Ginnheim, the Riederwald colony and the Rotenbusch Siedlung, Bornheimer Hang, at the eastern end of the city, and the Bruchfeldstraße Siedlung in Niederrad, south of the River Main. In the 1920s, financial support for housing was given to cities by the state only if they presented a general master plan for the whole of the urban area. Important local fiscal reforms that followed the currency consolidation of 1924 also promoted the restructuring of Frankfurt's building administration. Revenues from a newly introduced Hauszinssteuer, house interest tax, formed the essential basis for the realization of public building tasks. On top of that, loans from the Hauszinssteuer were given to private investors to build housing, but only if the standards and requirements of the Hochbauamt, the Frankfurt building authorities, were met. Together with Bruno Asch, the city's head of economic affairs, Landmann and architect Ernst May created an administration that was to provide, quote Ernst May, uniform answers to all questions of urban development from an economic, legal, cultural, or artistic point of view in accordance with a major program, end of quote. May was deeply influenced by the Garden City movement that had pioneered ideas of bigger scale planning in residential and landscape architecture in the late 19th century, and he presented a 10-year plan to meet the housing demands by building 10,000 apartments, a goal he came to exceed. Initially, May stood aside with Martin Elsasser as head of the building department, but the restructuring of the Hochbauamt With the restructuring, Elsasser's authority was limited to the management of the subordinate department E, Großbauten, with his most famous work, of course, being the Großmarkthalle, just really close to here. In addition to this, there were two other subunits, Department B, headed by Adolf Meyer, Building Consultancy, and Department T for Typification, headed by Eugen Kaufmann. Meyer also oversaw the Construction Supervision Agency and the Siedlungsamt, the Housing and Settlement Authority, with its departments of urban and regional planning, as well as of gardens and cemeteries. The realm of the New Frankfurt project exceeded the Hochbauamt, as can be exemplified by the work of Fritz Wichert. He was the founding director of the Frankfurt Art School, while also in charge of heritage conservation in the whole government district. My access to the New Frankfurt master planning was through the topic of standardized allotment garden sheds in the city area. It's okay. The Flächenverteilungsplan not only includes constructional and free space, but also allotment garden colonies that were for the first time permanently established in the city area. Quote Ernst May. The open space system that separates the satellite areas from the core city will, in the future, accommodate the permanent leases for allotment gardeners. As long as the cities still house tens of thousands of rented apartments away from all open spaces, it's necessary to give the inhabitants of such apartments the opportunity for outdoor activities. A uniform subdivision and uniform sheds will give these grounds the character of being ordered, of growing together organically with the city as a whole. The city as a whole, das Stadtganze, of which May speaks, extends on the one hand in the landscape and is made comprehensible on a two-dimensional city plan. Here, the ordered character can be measured by the distribution of designated areas. The city as a whole, on the other hand, to which a connection is to be established through the construction of uniformity, is an ideal entity that goes beyond this. It demands consistent shaping of the urban environment in all areas, or at least it did to Ernst May. Many threads run together at the journal Das Neue Frankfurt, published by May and Wichert. It was widely distributed at the time, and today it gives remarkable insights to a whole movement. It's the source for both maps we have been examining so far. In May's extended two-double-issue summary, 5 years of housing construction in Frankfurt am Main, he gives a simple explanation for his decentralized urban expansion with dependent satellites at the city edges. He claims it is, quote, built to maintain the health of the people by restoring natural living conditions in the big city, end of quote. But one must also acknowledge that city land was already so expensive that big-scale housing development was only possible far from the center and partially per expropriation of private property. New means of public transportation had made possible the interconnection with the core. But let us get back to the idea of das Stadtganze, the city as a whole, in the second meaning. Paging through the 1930 issues of Das Neue Frankfurt, we can get an impression of its scope. It includes the Futura typography by Paul Renner, teacher at the Frankfurt School, as well as the cover design for all issues by Grete and Hans Leistikow. Hans was also involved in the conception of a standardized color scheme for the housing project. In the typification department, everything repeatable was planned, as small as the door fitting standards for minimum dwellings by Ferdinand Kramer. Household items have been designed, mass-produced, advertised for in the New Frankfurt magazine and recommended through the selected canon of the Frankfurt Register. Some furniture has even been distributed through the municipal Hausrat GmbH to be made affordable. Grete Schütte-Lihotzky's Frankfurt Kitchen was a mandatory feature of the new dwellings, which of course were built relying on a set of ground floor types developed to utilize every inch of living space. Ideally, the new Siedlung and its surroundings would be deeply intertwined, as exemplified by the Siedlung Römerstadt and partly achieved with the Niedertal project. Public space all around the city was shaped through micro-buildings, public furniture, water points, and even a stylistic regulation of advertising and cemetery culture. And with this, we are back at the citywide scale. The new Frankfurt Stadtganze as ideal entity. Here you can see it visualized by Hans Leistikows' eagle emblem. And before we return to the present, let's take a short breathing pause in the mid-1970s, a time where some of the doctrines of modernity, like radical urban renewal or infinite growth, have been rightfully put into question, for instance, through the house occupations in the Frankfurt West End district. The fact that, at the same time, the new Frankfurt has been rediscovered as urban heritage reminds us that we fall short if we consider it an ingeniously envisioned campaign for the city's corporate identity. We can see that it is a remarkable thing that the approach of the time was not only to meet living requirements for the humble citizen, but to make this democratic design the key figure of the city image. Thank you very much, and also thank you for your patience with me holding on so tight to this script.
Excellently done. Thank you very much. We shall dive into a discussion after our short presentations. So let me just look if I do this correctly. Yes. Next up is Chiara Spangaro. She's an art historian and an independent curator based in Milan. Operating in the fields of contemporary art, architecture and design, she's curator of Fondazione Aldo Rossi. In collaboration with Germano Celant, and I'm sure I pronounced that wrong, she served as the curatorial associate for the Art and Architecture Department of the Triennale di Milano from 2009 to 2012, and was associated curator of exhibitions as Arts and Foods, Christo and Jean-Claude, Water Projects, Giovanni Castel, Amont, etc. And I'm really happy that you're here to talk about Aldo Rossi's plans. Thank you very much. And over to you, and you get the control of the images.
Control is a big word, but we'll see what happens. First of all, if it works, yes, if I can make it work. Okay, so from the real existence minimum to the idea of Aldo Rossi of existence minimum, I will talk about the Monte Amiata housing complex by Carlo Imonino and Aldo Rossi, built in Milan, Galleratese Quarter, between 1967 and 1973. In 1966, the Galleratese area appears in the background of the iconic video Il ragazzo della Via Gluck, which introduced the famous Italian singer Adriano Celentano. The ballad recounts the author's nostalgia for the rural landscape of his childhood, replaced by the growing suburbs of Milan. Oscillating between rural and urbanized landscape, the images were shot 1 year before Carlo Imonino and Aldo Rossi started the construction of the Monte Amiata housing complex. I believe it is really essential to underline Rossi's connection with Milan, where he was born in 1931 and trained since 1949 as an architect at the Politecnico. His attention to and this interest for the urban context originated from Milan, together with his inclination to consider history and culture, as well as the concept of fragment, all destined to become cornerstones of his architectural vision and work. Since the early 20th century, Milan became the industrial heart of the country, and during the Second World War, one of the largest hubs of the resistance to fascism. Bombed by both Germans and Allied weapons, by 1943 the city was largely destroyed, as you can see in Enrico Perezutti's extraordinary photography documentation of the bombing of Milan 1943 and the first moments of the reconstruction. Rossi belongs to a generation born after the one that looked and took an active part in the war against fascism, and that would be a major force in the reconstruction progress, and older than the students that would share in the '68 protest, raising the issue, among others, of returning the creative ability to community. When Aimonino involved Rossi in the Galleratese project, he did it in the wake of Rossi's profound knowledge of the city, as well as perceiving the great affinity between their respective research at the time, which also morphed into the civil passion and their joint militancy in the Italian Communist Party. The two had met in 1954 during the International Conference of Students and Young Architects close to Partito Comunista Italiano that focused on architecture and national traditions. It was organized in Rome by the Unione Internazionale Studenti. The subject quoted Antonio Gramsci's invitation to Italian intellectuals to seek their own national origins as popular. Rossi was the delegate of the Politecnico di Milano, and probably in the same occasion, Aimonino proposed him to participate to the Marxist-inspired weekly Il Contemporaneo, where he wrote on architecture, where they both wrote on architecture and urban planning. After that, in addition to their friendship and the teaching in the same time at the UAV in Venice, they also shared a deep interest in the urban planning from a theoretical point of view. Aimonino, publishing his writings in La città territorio, I problemi della prima dimensione, the city as a territory, the problems of the first dimension, in 1965, and Rossi issuing the architecture of the city the following year. The story is well known. The architecture of the 50s and 60s in Italy was the result of numerous intersections and ramifications, enacted by players that combined ideas and utopia with a pragmatic vision of their job. It was a collective story, in a way, as became also the Galleratese, a positive way, reaching the '68, when a new social and political awareness was bubbling up, brought by the new generations. The Monte Amiata complex participated in this emblematic story, which began in 1945 with the appointment of architect Piero Bottoni as Commissario Straordinario della Triennale by the National Liberation Committee of Upper Italy. The former partisan Bottoni brought together almost 100 of the best architects, Italian architects, engineers, artists, and technicians, to work on the pilot district of the Cutiotto, an urban planning more closely connected to social issues, which originated in the urgency of the post-war reconstruction. It is no coincidence that in 1951, Fernand Léger dedicated a copy of his booklet Les Constructeurs to Bottoni, calling him inventeur de montagne et de magnifiques constructions populaires, and showing his understanding of how Bottoni combined commitment and utopia, a response to social needs, and the ability to design places endowed with beauty and meaning. Here you can see very ancient images of the quartiere Cutiotto seen from the Montestella. Cutiotto, Montestella, and the two Galleratese lots were all part of a single revision project of the northwestern suburban territory of Milan. Bottoni's positive result with Cutiotto and Montestella showed how strong the combination of urban and landscape design could be and the quarter was an effective attempt to resist the perpetuation of urban additions, which had long been a characteristic of suburban building. Bottoni's project for the Galleratese was abandoned in the mid-50s. However, from the early 60s, the area returned as an object of a great interest. And this due to two factors: the new Italian law on the acquisition of lots for public housing and the growing demand of homes in Italy. This is the Monte Stella in its construction, and the Galleratese in the fog, something that doesn't exist anymore in Milan, and the site of the Monte Amiata. The 29 acres area on which the Monte Amiata complex was built has been owned by the Monte Amiata Mining Company since 1944. In 1967, the company commissioned the Rome-based AIDE office, formed by Carlo and Maurizio Imonino, Alessandro and Baldo De Rossi, with a project of social housing on 12 acres for a total capacity of 2,400 inhabitants. In November the same year, Imonino involved Rossi in the team to be in charge of bureaucratic process on site, as well as a designer. 2 years later, the Building Commission of Milan Municipality expressed a positive judgment on the project. In its final version, which included 4 buildings named A, B, C, and D, the latter entrusted to Aldo Rossi. In his 1970 writings, Il progetto dell'insediamento Galleratese 2 in Milano, Imonino defines the canons of his project in 2 primary points. The first being that of its formal complication, as a response to Manfredo Taffuri's accusation of a certain traditionalism in Imonino's previous social housing designs. The second was the use of elementary geometric figures, especially the triangle, as functional matrices for the final result. Imonino's initial idea of a single construction, articulated and yet more compact, moved then into 4 buildings arranged radially, related one to the other by elements such as ramps, overhead passageways, stairs, but also by commercial and entertainment spaces. The project, writes Imonino, has the task of breaking with the traditional conception of the private building, whose only relationship with the public areas of the city is given by the street entrance door. The project initiates a different way to structure residence and facilities. The first studies and drawings by Rossi for Building D date back to 1969 and resonate closely with his schematic ideas. Among the most intimate documents of that kind, the letter sent to his son Fausto described the construction in Fieri as a train. From this private, playful, and childish sketch that you can see on the left of the screen, as from the other studies, emerge the features that the architect explored in the first published writing on his vision. They were published again in 1970 in the book Carlo Imonino and Rossi wrote on 2 projects for Insediamento Gallarate 2 a Milano. Rossi recorded the 2 projects of San Rocco di Monza and the Gallaratese with their diversities, so as to clarify his research of form in architecture and of the typological form of the house. San Rocco features a complex of courtyards, while Gallaratese is a long unit built around a typical Milanese balcony, the so-called ballatoio. Rossi specified that having rigidly assumed these typological forms means acknowledging the prominence of typology also in the dwelling, a field in which the formal reduction of types is by now totally rigorous. He added that typological indifference means disorder in architecture, not referring to expressionistic disorder, but to the disorder of non-architecture, of non-choice. While not referring to his project for Gallaratese in his essay, it nevertheless raises some important points of the work in progress, also in relation to some previous projects, such as San Rocco, with Giorgio Grassi, the Pavilion of the Triennale with Luca Meda, and the Villa ai Ronchi with Leonardo Ferrari, that actually was Rossi's first build project. These experiences triggered for Rossi theoretical issues that he then applied to the Monte Amiata. One, this is a beautiful maxi drawing of the Monte Amiata. One is the relationship with the city, its configuration, layout, and history, in this case Milan, which explains the balcony structure of the building. Two, conceiving the task of contemporary architecture as creating a concrete alternative to the professional and commercial architecture that surrounds us. In order to pursue this goal, Rossi insisted that, I quote, "The analysis of the architecture of the ancient world, classical and Gothic, and of the modern movement are a contribution to this new foundation." Three, the awareness that the progress of dwelling is a matter too closely enmeshed to the evolution of society and class conflicts to think that a few inventions are enough to change it. I am sure many among you have seen Rossi's Gallaratese live or in pictures. It consists of a 182 meters long and 12 meters deep building covered in white plaster. The arcaded ground floor is on 2 levels, connected by a staircase. The portico is made up of 3-meter deep walls and 1-meter deep pillars. And the whole construction develops along this horizontal passage. As Rossi underlined in this report, the typological shape of the balcony works as an internal elevated road. The cut that corresponds to the columns coincides with the expansion joint. At this point, the whole building, both in plan and in elevation, presents the moment of greatest tension. The metaphysical and essential poetics of Rossi's building also depends on the larger logic of his design, the plastic strength of the large column, which recalled the Venetian fragment of the Ca del Duca and the broken cylinders of the Cabruta by Giovanni Muzio, the regularity of pillar walls and the stair groups, the accesses to the stairs that open both from the porch and from the outside, the correspondence between the ground floor and elevation, the continuity of the open gallery thanks to square cuts in the masonry, the plan of apartments, mainly 2 rooms plus kitchen and bathroom with 1 or 2 loggias each. In 1974, when the building was just finished and the apartments were still empty, Rossi imagined this architecture as a background of his inhabitants' lives and wrote in Controspazio, "I am convinced that the spaces planned for this daily life, the large portico, the walkway streets, the loggia, will highlight the dense flow of daily life and the deep popular roots of this residential architecture for this large house which could line up the Milanese Canal or any other canal in Lombardy." However, the photographs of the time show instead a deserted landscape closer to Sironi's painting and more suitable for individual and metaphysical meditation. Candor and simplicity that stands out against the colorful complexity of Aimonino buildings, so much so that Rossi in a 1972 letter to his friend defines the complex as a strange creature, a red dinosaur with a rigid and long white tail, which now rises terribly over the plain. Between March and May 74, while the owner was signing a contract with the municipality of Milan for the sale of the lodging, the buildings were occupied by workers and students protesting under the pressure of popular claims related to the scantiness of affordable housing in Milan. The origin of the protest could actually be also found in the typological and formal choices made by Rossi and Daimonino, which do not conform to the traditional conception of the social housing. In fact, emblematic phrases were published in the major national newspapers, among which is worth recalling Il Giorno, where was written that the buildings built under the economic popular label have all their attributes that qualify luxury homes. The complex does not present itself as popular, but displays a search for architectural solutions that make it to look like a residence closer to the stately one. And the Corriere della Sera in September writes that the apartments are not suitable for large families. Today, Gallaratese is present in the memories of those who arrived in the district in the 60s and proudly participated on its growth, and in the utopian idea of a model urban area. Incidentally, it was also visited by the Pope, John Paul II, in 1983. Since the 90s, Daimonino's project, and more rarely Rossi's too, has also been the backdrop for several music videos again of Italian singers like Casino Royale, Coma Cose, Fede Campa, and Annalisa. They offer a chromatic, geometric, and iconic staging where the difference in scale between the individual and the building is evident, sometimes in a vaguely dystopian key. To conclude, let us return to the architecture of the city, where Rossi emphasizes that while it is true that the city can also be explained historically, it is also articulated by the unfathomable dimension of direct experience. In other words, the subjective and somehow autobiographical experience of the people who lived there and transformed it completely, as in the single life of its building. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chiara. What a building. Impressive. Jump to Frankfurt again. And I want to introduce Christoph Packhieser, who studied architecture with a focus on urban planning at the University of Wuppertal and is a registered urban planner. Since 2001, he has worked as a project manager for planning offices in Berlin, Zurich, Aachen, and Frankfurt am Main on topics of urban development and master planning. As part of a teaching assignment at the Hafen City University in Hamburg, he worked on the transformation of a cultural landscape into a post-agricultural agglomeration. Since 2017, he has been working for the Frankfurt am Main Urban Planning Department in the area of public space, and since 2019 in the area of urban planning. The current focus of his work and his talk today is the update of the high-rise development plan and the conception of a productive quarter in the west of Frankfurt. That's not what we're going to cover today. You come back for that one.
I come back for that.
Over to you, and thank you for coming.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, well, thank you for having me, and it's a pleasure for me to show you with this presentation to show you about the master planning for high-rise development in Frankfurt am Main. And today, Frankfurt am Main is one of Europe's major financial centers, but it has been a center for trade and commerce since medieval times. However, Frankfurt's significance extends far beyond its economic prowess. The city has a rich historical and cultural heritage that spans centuries. Moreover, Frankfurt is a central hub in transport infrastructure of Germany and Europe, and in the motorway and railway network, in air traffic and also in data traffic, since Frankfurt has one of the most powerful internet nodes in the world. In other words, whatever you do, you can't get around Frankfurt. The city has undergone a significant transformation over the years after World War II. Today, the skyline is characterized by an impressive collection of high-rise buildings and has become iconic not only in Germany, but also internationally. Along with London, Paris, Moscow, and Warsaw, Frankfurt is one of Europe's most important high-rise cities. Frankfurt today has 38 skyscrapers with a structural height of at least 100 meters, 18 of Germany's current 19 skyscrapers, which means buildings that are 150 meters or more in height are in Frankfurt. Skyscrapers have become the expression of a contemporary urban lifestyle in a truly global city. The skyline gives the city a unique and unmistakable identity and shapes the way people of Frankfurt see themselves. The history of high-rise development in Frankfurt dates back to the period after the Second World War, when the city was extensively rebuilt. This led to the construction of the first high-rise buildings, based on the first master plan, the Wallanlagen concept from 1953. This plan limits the high-rise locations to prominent points at city entrances, bridgeheads, and for prominent uses. The Wallanlagen concept stated that the high-rises should be built along the Wallanlagen at a right angle to it. With the Finger Plan of 1968, new locations were to be created along the axis of main roads from the city center. The idea behind this was the new underground lines planned along these axes would connect the buildings. At the same time, the municipality wanted to relieve the inner city of development pressure. However, the intention to limit or even avoid conflicts through regulation failed. In order to secure building plots, investors acquired properties mainly along the development axis of Bockenheimer Landstraße and evicted the tenants of the mainly residential buildings. Massive protests followed, which went down in the city's history as the Häuserkampf. New ideas were needed. In the 1970s, the Bankenplan gave rise to the idea of concentrating high-rise buildings in a cluster in the banking district around the green center of the Wallanlagen. This also was the birth of the distant skyline as we know it today. At the beginning of the 1980s, the administration commissioned Albert Speer Jr. to draw up the City Light Plan, which proposed new high-density, high-rise office buildings along the Mainzer and Hanauer Landstraße axis, because the banking district was considered to be finished. Thus, the cluster idea was abandoned once again. The most important goal was to secure housing in the city and yet create central jobs. Another important component of the plan was the upgrading of Frankfurt's East. The 1990s Bankenviertel Masterplan again proposed new high-rise locations, mainly in the traditional banking district. At this point, it becomes clear that the various master plans are always associated with a piece of the city's economic and social history, and that the respective zeitgeist was also satisfied, be it the rather picturesque approach of arranging high-rise buildings like city gates on the historic plan, or also the linear axis concept, such as the so-called Finger Plan or the City Light Plan. And it should not be forgotten that a number of high-rise building developments have come into being regardless of these plans. Therefore, the high-rise development plan by the office of Jordan und Müller from 1998 was intended to finally bring together the previous experiences and future planning perspectives in the idea of the high-rise cluster. The high-rise development plan Frankfurt 2000 aimed to develop 3 high-rise clusters by further densifying the existing banking district, building on the former goods station site as the trade fair cluster, and developing the track field of the main station, which was to disappear underground, as a park cluster. The plan defined potential sites for 15 new high-rise buildings, but since the plans for underground station were put on hold in 2006 due to the lack of funds, the park cluster could never be developed. The 2008 high-rise development plan, also by Jordan and Müller, deliberately continues the concept of 2000 master plan for the first time. 22 new high-rise buildings were proposed at 15 locations, including 4 residential high-rise buildings. The master plan identifies various clusters or develops the existing clusters further, like the banking district and the trade fair cluster. It establishes the new high-rise location north of the Zeil, the access along Mainzer Landstraße, the city portals east and west, as well as the landmark at the main railway station. And in the present, as the current master plan is still undergoing political consultations, no statements on new locations are possible at this point. So I'm afraid, but nevertheless, I give you a little sneak preview because the current update of the high-rise development plan in 2023 represents the 3rd edition of the 1998 plan and continues to its objectives. The aim is to achieve moderate and cautious development that protects the established spatial settlement structures. The focus will not be on setting new height records. That's not our aim. No. We're not into that race. So in practical terms, that means there will be no towers with a height more than 200 meters. And I think that race will be won in Asia or in the Arab countries, but not in Frankfurt. And our aim is to integrate high-rise buildings into holistic urban planning that enables a sensible mix of uses and sustainable mobility and urbanity. In this way, these buildings can be an important part of the European mixed-use city and contribute to the creation of a vibrant, sustainable and attractive city. So they create vertical urbanity. Therefore, our goal is not to build the tallest, but the highest quality and, you may have guessed it, the most sustainable high-rise buildings in Frankfurt ever. And we would like to give you a sneak preview of the topics that are relevant to us for the implementation of more sustainable high-rise buildings. For us, sustainability at this point of the high-rise development plan refers first of all to topics with relevance to urban space, and in further steps, however, topics such as energy and building materials will also be considered. And yes, these are the main planning principles, like we try to strengthen the existing clusters, and we try to preserve the solitaires, which mainly is the European Central Bank, which is not far away. And And we're trying to preserve the I called it the staggering of high-rise buildings. I don't know if that is the correct term for it, but like we're trying to meet like horizontal city and vertical city, like the horizontal city of the parameter block development and the vertical city of the high-rise clusters. So we like the Frankfurt principle is not like a mediation between the lower city type and the high-rise building, but we find it, yeah, it's a clear cut here. Yeah. Obviously, we try to complete the existing clusters, so it's not a plan with grand gestures or with new urban new clusters, but we're trying to analyze the existing clusters and see where there are special places where buildings can still be fitted in harmoniously. And obviously, one of the biggest themes we have, or the biggest theme, is the promotion of a mixed use. Like we see a very high potential in having these mixed use towers, which will be not like in the past where you have got monofunctional structured office buildings, and so we're trying to, that's what I call the urban the vertical urbanity, like to transport the urbanity within to the buildings. Yeah, this is just to give you a slide overview, like mixed use. I was just talking about. We're trying to integrate public use facilities on the top of the buildings, so everybody's got the possibility to enjoy the view from the top. We have 30% of residential use within each building, so that is mandatory for every building, every high-rise building. And we're trying to integrate cultural and social facilities, like it's already been done with the Museum for Modern Art. And obviously things like social infrastructure, kindergartens, and probably even schools could be our new new additions. Yeah, thank you. Usable roofscape is a theme, obviously. Active ground floor uses, which are going to support streets and squares, and they need to have several entrances, so this makes it more attractive to go in and into the building, and it connects the building obviously with the public space in a more frequent way. I'm not going into all of these points, otherwise this would be like, it could, yeah, a lecture on its own. And as we are still working, this is like working process, so it's just a sneak preview, but it shows that we're working on principles for the buildings itself. Some of them I mentioned before, like having the top floor for public uses. And we have themes about public space, where we try to activate public space surrounding the high-rise buildings, which is like in the banking district, where we have the Wallanlagen, which is a very nice green space, and we're trying to connect these two worlds together, like the free space and the high-rise buildings. Obviously, we have to look at things like wind and obviously like shade. And one big thing also is mobility, where we're trying to develop concepts which obviously, like a sustainable high-rise building is only achieved when you can have a public transport, and not everybody goes there with the big car. And obviously, like the buildings are in the middle of the center, so there's a good connection to public transport. Yes, and last but not least, obviously the planning process we are implementing. We're just now implementing this planning process, which isn't too much away from what we did in the past, but it has some iterations now. Like it's starting with the project idea when the developer comes to the municipality, and from that we start with a feasibility study to see what is possible for this plot, and from that we go into a preliminary study where we check everything like the climate, like mobility, and this is then being transferred back into the feasibility study. And so then with these facts we can start the competition first. So from that we have a much more intense view on all these topics, and also, like I mentioned before, the sustainability, which is a real big thing for us to integrate into high-rise building planning and developing in the future. And from that we go on to a project-related legal zoning plan, which is another instrument where we're trying to implement a lot more of these sustainability factors. Okay, well then thank you for your attention, and it's a big topic, but it's just a little preview for all of it.
Thank you, Christoph. This was really interesting. And I think it's a well-fitting continuation of Aldo Rossi, just on a different scale, not on the horizontal, but rather on the vertical. But both deal with similar topics, of course. So the next one, we stay in Frankfurt and zoom out for a bit. Ludwig Korte, who also works for the urban planning department, he studied geography at the University of Münster. He's a graduate engineer in spatial planning from the Technical University of Dortmund. He was a research assistant at the Technical University of Hamburg-Harburg and was also working for the Urban Development Department of Düsseldorf. It's also a nice city, by the way. Since 2011, he is working for the Urban Development Department of Frankfurt in the fields of land use and regional planning, and he will talk more about integrated urban development plan of Frankfurt. Welcome and thank you, and over to you.
Thank you. Do I have to press the button or?
Mm-hmm. It should work, hopefully.
Okay. Okay. Oh.
Now it
Start?
works.
Okay.
Now it works.
Now it's working. Yeah, thank you for the introduction. The topic is master plans. This is the Urban Development Master Plan of Frankfurt. It was adopted in 2019, so it's now 4 years old. And I want to tell you a bit about the content and what was the outcome of this plan. Of course, I wanted to start with, well, why did we do this? The driving force behind the plan was growth, of course. You see here the development of the population of Frankfurt. It's quite impressive. You see from about, well, 2004 or 5, the only way is up. There's a short break because of the pandemic, of course. But all experts say this is just a short break. This is not a change of long-term tendencies. So we see a further prognosis which says that we will have from now on 90,000 more inhabitants in 2045. So as I said, the plan was adopted in 2019. We started working with 2014. So at that time, we already had some of this development. It was already felt, the extreme growth and the shortage of residential and commercial zones. And we calculated a deficit of 90,000 housing units, which is quite a lot. And one result of this is the rising estate prices and, of course, the rental costs. And, well, also it was felt that we have a lack of coordination, orientation within the city to meet this challenge of this growth. And we didn't have a preceding concept. Frankfurt has not really a tradition of long-term development plans. I think the last approaches were in the 70s. And another problem was we have the regional land use plan, which should provide us with sufficient building land to meet the challenges of growth. But this plan was made, well, during 2000 up to 2010. And at that time, well, the reurbanization, which we call it today, was just starting. You can see it from the data, but at that time, no one really predicted this development. You can say it now. So it's not the fault of the plan. I think nearly nobody did expect this amount of growth. As early as 2015, already a need for an update of this plan was felt, and we prepared ourselves with the integrated urban development concept for this update of this plan. So we took action. Well, I call it input. We put 5 years into this plan, starting 2014 to 2019. 12 departments of the public administration were involved. Well, it was a department of mobility, a social department, department for schools, for economic development, for environment, to name a few. We had numerous discussions with external experts who helped us working on this plan. We had numerous public participations, events all around the city. And also you can see the picture on the right is the German Museum of Architecture, where it usually is. Well, and the output was 4 scenarios of development, 6 objectives, 8 focus spaces, and 24 key projects. Don't worry, I don't want to tell you about all these key projects, but I want to tell you a few things about the scenarios, the objectives, and the focus spaces. So first, the objective. Here you see the plan. The objectives of this plan. First, Frankfurt for all, which is like the social goal. Everyone should afford living in Frankfurt. The second goal, dynamic economic metropolis, is the economic goal. There should be place for industry and retail and commercial sites for the economic development. Third goal, more Frankfurt, which is like a yes to growth. Yes, we want to take up the challenge. We want to meet this challenge. Number 4 is Frankfurt respects the environment and climate. This is like the ecological goal, where we want to preserve green spaces, open spaces, meet the challenges of climate change, and also have a city-friendly mobility. Number 5, the region is the city. That means, well, we have to do our work here in Frankfurt, but we cannot solve every problem alone, so we have to collaborate with the region in many fields. And number 6, urban planning as a community task is more a process goal. Things can only be done with collaboration between politics, public administration, science, economy, and so on. And well, all these goals have a spatial impact. we can meet these impacts by, development and greenfield development outside the existing structures. We can convert land within the structures, for example, from economic sites to housing sites, or we can densify the existing structures, which should be in regard to sustainability the first thing to do. And before I come to densification, we also discussed growth. Well, I said 90,000 housing units were missing. Well, that's a calculated number. It's not automatically a goal. Some people say, well, why do we have to deliver 90,000 units? Well, why not less? Well, then less people come, and that solves the problem. So that was a discussion about the disadvantages if you not meet the demand. Well, you have the rising costs, of course. Many people can't afford living in Frankfurt anymore. They have to move out. We have more commuters to Frankfurt. We have less economical progress. So on this level, it was quite good to discuss this, because on this level people see more advantages in growth, as they do when the growth happens, in the neighborhood. And the other question was, do we want to grow within the structures we have, or this is the green parts, or to a certain degree also on green fields? And it was clear the challenges are so big, we have to grow inside and outside. So densification was the first task. Well, we started from here. A white piece of paper. We had very little data. We really didn't know how dense is the city in the different parts. We had to create it all ourselves. And we did. We were searching for densification areas, and first thing we did, calculate the density of the city and pick out the housing areas, because it's densification of housing is what we're looking for. And you see two colors here, yellow dots and red dots. That shows kind of a discussion we had. What is high density? We have numbers in the federal building law. I looked that word up. It's the floor space ratio. It's the Geschossflächenzahl. And there are certain numbers for orientation. 1.2 is for housing areas, but it goes up to 3.0 for mixed-use areas. So the yellow ones are from 1.2 and the red ones are 3.0. So there was an interesting discussion. Then we put on a filter with strong restrictions, which were, for example, areas under the law of preservation, monument preservation. We cut that out. And second one was, as I remember, recent legal zoning plans. Well, because we saw it as a problem, you put on a zoning plan somewhere a few years ago, and then you come again, hello, and now we want to densify this area. And the people have just built their houses, and the plan is quite recent. So there was another thing we cut out. And the third step was the potential within these areas we are filtering out. And we said, okay, the potential of an area should be at least 50 housing units. So that it makes sense to go there and promote densification, because it has a certain outcome. And we were just picking areas with apartment housing, not single-family houses or twin-family houses, because of the number of owners we have in these areas, single houses, and the number of the outcome. Maybe you have a single house area with very low density, but you have maybe 2 or maximum 3 floors per building, and you can't go there and build 5 floors next to it. So you can't get much out of it, and but on the other hand, you have many onus and many troubles. So this analysis was put into the other ideas we had for internal and external development. Here you see, I think it's about 230 ideas. The blue ones are industrial sites. Some are greenfield developments, some are densification. The red ones are for housing. The light red ones are greenfield development, and the darker ones, the densification I mentioned. The red ones are conversion sites. So many ideas, and again we were filtering. We put on a few criteria. First was urbanity. We looked at the quality of the sites. It's from a planner's view. This development in this place really makes sense? Does it enhance the quality of life, of urbanity? There we threw out some of the densification ideas by taking a closer look and not only generate them by data. And then also the proximity to centers, to the city center or to the centers in the district was an important issue. So where people can meet their daily demands on foot or by bike. Which brings me to the second part of criteria. Mobility, of course, connection to public transport, especially light rail and rail. And road capacity. Is there a road nearby which can take the amount of new traffic which will come from the new developments? And third, environmental impacts. Does this new developments affect our green belt? I'm not sure if green belt was a topic here already. Okay, so you will hear more about, next time. And last one, ecology. We looked at, are there ecologic sensitive areas for flora or fauna preservation, or are they important for the city climate? And there were points to gain in every criteria, and this is the rating, the outcome. The simple one, 3 categories, like a traffic light. The red ones have quite a lot of problems, or one very serious problems. The yellow ones, well, in the middle, yeah, have to take a closer look, and the green ones looked quite good. And this went into a political discussion and was transferred to the outcome of the integrated urban development concept, the strategy plan. All the selected projects are here in this plan. Also traffic projects, environmental projects. So we have a holistic plan of the whole city. Well, if you look at it, maybe too complicated for the short time we have. We can make it simpler like this. We also had a few focus spaces, 8 focus spaces, where the energy should be concentrated, the action, and looking from today, the plan is 4 years old, as I mentioned. We can say, okay, it's not just paper, it is really putting something into reality. In every one of these focus spaces, something is happening. I don't want to mention all of this, don't worry, maybe on the upper left, new district, this is the biggest project at the moment in Frankfurt. New housing development, about 7,000 new housing units for about 17,000 new inhabitants. In the middle, at the top, densification. As I mentioned, from all these densification sites we found quite a concentration in this part of the city. We call it the middle north. It's not too far from the center, but it's not very dense. So, but it's very, very well. It has a good public transport. So this area was chosen especially for densification. We have 2 densification managers now within the Department of Urban Development who care for this region, who speak to the owners to convince them to densify their real estate. And yeah, we have also green spaces development. The enclosure of the motorway A661 is a big project through which we gain a new green connection, and this reduces also noise. So maybe we can gain new housing sites in the surrounding. Of course, the inner city is always a topic. We have numerous projects going on there. One deals with the effects of the corona pandemic. What will be the city center of the future? And some more waterfront development, a project Christoph is working on, yeah. Convergent sites, urban renewal, and also restructuring of industrial zones. I don't want to go too much into detail. So I would say a thumbs up for our concept. This is the last slide. I just want to mention some further improvements which such a plan makes. You have a context for all these projects. If you have to explain these projects, you can also put them into larger context. They have a background, they have a story, because it's always important to explain things over and over again. We have a better argumentation towards other planning authorities, especially on the regional level. I mentioned the regional land use plan, which is now updated. We have a better understanding within the public administration itself. I got to know some colleagues which I didn't know before this process, and you meet again, and yeah, remember when we were discussing this, and it has a social, personal use. Higher efficiency in following processes, of course. Some decisions are made in this plan, some discussions are made within this plan, and they don't have to made again when you go to the single projects. And well, a question I put on, is it the start of a new planning tradition? As I mentioned, there is no really tradition in long-term development plans in Frankfurt. It was a jumping from project to project. Maybe it is a new start. I would say, hopefully. And if you know more, want to know more about all of this, of course, you can visit the homepage of the planning department. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much for this wonderful path through the integrated urban development plan of Frankfurt. Now, for our last but not least presentation, I'm happy to have Eran Meyerson here from Tel Aviv. He lives in Tel Aviv, and he studied architecture at the Bezalel Academy of Arts in Jerusalem. I'm sure I pronounced this wrong. And then did a master's in urban design at the University of Sydney. And he is a member of the Tel Aviv Masterplan editing team, and he's head of East Tel Aviv Planning Unit in the City Planning Department. So he's the right person at the right place right now. Over to you, and welcome, and thank you for coming.
Thank you, Andrea, for inviting me, and the Deutsche Architecture Museum, and also thank you, the Liebling House in Tel Aviv, for arranging this meeting for us. So I will start with some figures and some data of Tel Aviv in the current moment and in forecast for the next 10 years. I will speak also a little bit about the planning system in Israel and the hierarchy of plans, and then we will address some of the issues that concerning us with the master plan of Tel Aviv. So at the moment, Tel Aviv has a population of 470,000 people, and the forecast is for another 230,000 more people in the next 10 years. The housing units are 216,000, and we expect a growth of 60,000 units, and also a growth of 1 million square meters of employment in the next 10 years. And also the size of Tel Aviv is about 51 square kilometers. It's I think fifth of Frankfurt, and the population is about a third. This is the planning hierarchy in Israel. It begins with national master plans that describe the railroads and national parks and the main roads and such things. And then there are 5 districts. Israel is divided to 5 districts: south, north, center, and Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. That each district has its own master plan. And from that on, we have local master plan and so on. There's a long hierarchy. And at the end of it, you have, it's a long way till it reaches the building permit, the construction itself. So there's a long way to go from planning to actually implementing the buildings themselves. So once you actually see a crane, it actually builds an environment that was planned probably 10 or 15 years ago. So actually the city always builds itself in the past, and that's why we have to continuously updating the plans of the city. We started with the city profile that draws the characteristics of Tel Aviv in 2002. And from there we went to the vision, that the future picture of Tel Aviv, and then the strategic plan that actually draws the tools to reach those goals from in the vision, and then the master plan that is actually a legal document that constructs the environment. And once we finished that, we started the cycle all over again, and it will go on probably forever. At the moment, we are in the middle of updating, middle process of updating the master plan. We started about 18 months ago, and we think we will finish in another year and a half. And this is after the first master plan was actually issued in 2016. So it was working about 6 years, and then we updated it, and we already know that we're going to update it again, and we have some issues that we don't address now, and we know that we will address probably a few years ahead. So we will talk about some issues and challenges that concerning us in Tel Aviv and how we address them in the master plan. First of all is housing and urban renewal. We about 36% of households pay more than half of their income just for housing, and this number is increasing. And we see that about 30 years ago, the household just spent about 28% of the income, and today is over 53%. We also having increasing the number of high rises building and high buildings that also make more expensive maintenance for the building and expenses. Today, I think we hardly build any building under 8 floors. And most of the projects we have are actually in urban renewal areas, in occupied areas. So we start actually with 4-story buildings that are demolished, and then they become like between 8 to 20 and more than that, and 30 and so on. So buildings are getting more and more expensive and more complicated to maintain. One way we address it is by creating affordable housing. Each project that we have on the table today has to have between 10 to 15% of the units for affordable housing, which means there will be for rent for at least 25 years at a 40% discount from the market price. And that will enable to reduce expenses for some parts of the communities. Another thing that we do, because of most of our projects are actually renewal urban projects, because we don't have open spaces in Tel Aviv. Everything is already occupied. And some neighborhoods are low income neighborhoods, and people don't actually pay for maintenance of their houses. It's very simple houses. They don't have a complicated system, fire systems and water system and drainage and underground parking and so on. And they don't pay anything, actually. And once we demolish those neighborhoods and rebuild them, those people will suddenly have to pay huge amounts of maintenance for their homes, and they don't have that money. So what we do is we open a funding by the entrepreneur, by the contractor, by the people who build these buildings to subsidize the returning residents' maintenance fees for at least 10 years. Another issue that we should address is the environment change. We all affected by that. It's a challenge for probably every city everywhere. There are repeating events of storms, of flooding, and increasing events of heat in the cities, and it become more and more rapid. And the sea level rise is still ahead of us. I don't know what we will do with that, but this is something we should also address probably in the next updating of the master plan. So I will talk about a few things that we do to respond to that. First, we create a green skeleton in the city, and we try to make more and more green spaces and to connect between them. In order to reduce the heat in the city. And we also, another thing that we do is we turn roads into streets, reduce the traffic lanes, and make more place for pavements, and for trees planting, and for shade. And in that way, we also increase the ability of people to walk in the streets and not just to drive in them. Another thing that we do is we locate places that are at risk of flooding, and we we ask the buildings, the lots, every project, they have to maintain its own water to contain the water inside the lot and not to let it flow into the city infrastructure that cannot absorb those flooding water in those events. So every lot has to actually maintain the water inside the lot and just let it go after the flood is over. We also create in open spaces underground containers to contain water in the public space. Another issue that we deal with is employment and trade and mixed uses, things that become in some ways very hard to maintain in the city in some ways. We can see that in the center of Tel Aviv, about 8% of the streets are commercial streets. 8% of the length of the street, so these are very active streets. But in the rest of the city, the number are much lower, and the streets are mostly residential and hardly active, behaving as active streets. And this is one problem that we have with the spatial places of the active employment and commercial areas. Another problem that we have is the reduction of craft businesses and workshops and artistic creative people that from one side they can't afford anymore to stay in the city, and they also in many times they are in conflict with the residential growing areas. Excuse me. So we respond to that by creating more active streets that will have to have on the ground level commercial spaces or employment spaces or public spaces, anything but residential, to spread the working spaces and the active spaces in the city, so people won't have to drive to the grocery or to get public services or something like that. So we spread it along the city and activate more and more streets. Another thing is that we increase the mixed-use areas. And we address it also by developing small neighborhood commercial centers into employment centers. So every neighborhood can now also have the opportunity to have working areas within it, and not just to drive out to a CBD or something. So we spread the commercial buildings inside the neighborhoods. And we create non-residential areas in the city in order to let the crafts and the crafts that are in conflict with the residential areas, so they can work in those places, and also these places can have the nightlife that are also in conflict with residential areas. So in that way, those employment facilities, let's say, they don't have to find themselves outside the city, and they can find a place in the city. Another issue is the public space. The problem that we have actually with the public space, because most of the projects are urban renewal projects, so in order to demolish and rebuild those areas, you need a certain amount of space, of residential space, about 4 times the existing volumes and 3 times the existing units, and and you need space for that. And in order to build it, to have those new units and more residents, you have to also give them public facilities, and you need land for that also. So once you take actually expropriate the land from the private land in order to give the public supplies, so you reduce the volumes of the building, and projects become not profitable and not feasible. So we actually changed the way we mix between those this conflict that we have for public facilities that are in conflict with private buildings, by actually calculating the volumes by the existing lot, the existing size of the lot, and not the future size of the lot. So once you have the volumes that you need in order to make a project feasible, you can already take as much land as you need for public services without affecting the commercial and residential volumes, just the arrangement in the space in the lot. So this conflict should be solved, partly solved, I think. I will go to the, I think, the last issue, which is transportation and mobility. Today, the most common way to move in Tel Aviv is by private car, and this is a huge problem. It's impossible to have that. It's like Tel Aviv is one huge traffic jam, and it also causes pollution. So at the moment we have in construction 3 light rail lines. The first one, the red one, should be open in the very near future, and the other 2 in the next 2 or 3 years. And also there's in plan now 3 metro lines that should be open in about 15 years, I guess 10 to 15 years. And this should reduce dramatically the use of cars in the city. Another thing is changing, turning the pyramid. Sorry. So, as I said before, today the dominant element in the streets are cars, and we actually reduce the structure for private cars and reduce the lanes of cars, and we create more and more public area within the existing streets for pedestrians, for shading, for trees, and we also implement designated lanes for public transport, so the public transport can move easily around the city while the cars stay probably in traffic jams. And I think this is about it.
Thank you very much. So, we all face the same problems, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's really interesting. I mean, we have now examples from Milan, from Frankfurt, and from Tel Aviv, which are all growing. And I think that unites us amongst each other. I mean, we're lucky enough that we have growth, and we're not losing people to some other areas, which comes, of course, then we face all these challenges, and which were faced already in the 1920s, and we're back to the same story, it seems. What I think is interesting is the different scales. If you, I mean, Ludwig, you proposed that the master plan developed for Frankfurt 2030 plus could be a change in planning culture or planning tradition. And you said, okay, things are moving already. And Eran, you said the city is always planning in or building its past. You also, Ludwig, from a Frankfurt perspective, would you agree with Eran that Frankfurt is building its past? Or have we, in this planning structure, I think we have developed since after the Second World War, better chance of not building the past, but actually developing the future? What do you think?
I hope so, that we are not just building the past, but learn from it. Also, the challenges we have today are different than we had in the past. We have the growth, okay, but today we have the challenge, of course, everybody's talking about, of climate change, which we hadn't in those days. So I think we can't repeat the past. We shouldn't. We should learn from it. Not everything has to be made different. There are good aspects, but there are aspects that have to be developed. And so it's my my opinion. I would say the growth of building sites, of build up land, and the reduction of green spaces, I think we have not only to look at the buildings, but at the green spaces. Because it's one effect, they become smaller. So there must be an increase in quality. And I think we must look at that a bit more. We have a discussion about agriculture in Frankfurt. One may question if we get a lot of quality out of agricultural sites for the people who live here, who need green spaces for relaxation. So I think we have to look more into the green spaces.
That was interesting. Eran started with the green spaces, and I think that's a totally different outlook compared to what we did so far. We looked at buildings, traffic, and then green spaces, and I think it's exceptional that you started with the green spaces.
I'm not sure, because you have green spaces.
We do, yeah.
You have a lot of green spaces, so maybe it doesn't bother you as much as it bothers Tel Aviv, that doesn't have any green spaces, and it's all surrounded by other cities. So it's a big challenge to create those spaces, and especially in already occupied areas that you have to condense and intensify, and along with that you have to also create these open spaces. So it is a challenge, a big challenge in Tel Aviv, and maybe you also think about not taking a lot of this land in the future plans of Frankfurt, but because it's a really something that is reducing, and it's also, it doesn't have a mouth, and it doesn't have an interest, and it can't speak for itself. So it's very easy just to take it and build it, and there's money interest and and other interests that are much more urgent always than those green spaces. But I think this is our responsibility really to create them as much as possible.
Very true. I mean, Ernst May when he started with his housing estates, he always considered green spaces an integral part. And Frankfurt is trying to become a World Heritage Site, exactly on that concept, to really make a point of it, to say, okay, the housing estates and the green space need to be together. And we will discuss that in the next episode, actually, on 6th of July. So please reserve time for that. And you also talked, when you talked about the housing estates in Milan building up, that they also considered the spaces around it, even if it wasn't the outcome as intended. But how is it today in Milan?
Milan continue to be a city in fragments, in a way, as it was when Aldo grew up in it. Many new buildings have been built in the last 15, 20 years, and more are growing because also of the Olympic Games, the Winter Olympic Games. So the whole Olympic area is developed and it's very central to the city. It changes a lot. And what's happening, I think this is really different from Frankfurt. The city of Milan is more and more devoted to tourism. It's a phenomenon that, I don't know in depth, but I see as a citizen and as a Milanese. I think that, Italy is a lot about art and somehow also the regulation, so it's very difficult probably to find the balance between the center and the peripheric areas. So, we'll see. We had a very, very good mayor in the last 8 years, and it's going to change soon, and maybe we'll see what happens.
Would you wish for a master plan like Frankfurt developed, or like Tel Aviv is updating?
Of course, I would love a master plan in Milan. Usually in Milan they do master plans on areas, and Milan is not a very big city, so it could be nice to have one that is overall. And yes, of course, so as a tradition in some Italian cities, the center of the city was usually the poorest part and the more, let's say, popular. And this has changed in Milan in the 80s when the Partito Socialista was in the mayor's office, or actually the mayor was a Socialista. But then some islands still remain in the center, and you could tell that they come from very different stories. But it's getting more and more as a city as Paris or London, or where the city center is domain for tourists or wealthy people. So let's hope it's not going to be like this.
Very true. Tel Aviv and Frankfurt both have regulations or introduced regulations that social housing shall be an integral part of every densified or developed plot. I think in Frankfurt we're doing this already for some time, if I remember correctly.
Yes, we have the, what's the English word for Baulandbeschluss?
Let me look this up quickly.
If new land is developed for housing, this decision says that a certain amount, a certain percentage of the housing units which are built there should be social housing. It's 30%, and another percentage for building communities who build their own concepts, you might say. So we have that already, but the problem is, I think, the effect is on new developments, on new legal zoning plans, which, well, maybe are 1% of the whole city. The most of the city is already built. So it is important, but the overall effect is maybe not as large as you might think.
How do you deal with this in Tel Aviv? You go per lot?
Per project, per plan. It doesn't mean that every plot has to contain affordable housing, but every plan has to contain it. And we try to spread it in every building, not to have like buildings that have only affordable housing and like dividing, social groups. So we try to combine those affordable housing with every building.
Since when are you doing this?
It's very recent. It's because it depends on national legislation. The city cannot do it by itself. Cannot decide that it does it, and we waited for national legislation. I think if Tel Aviv would determine the rules, it would be more extreme, I guess. The fact that it's only for 25 years that it ends, actually, I think it's problematic. It makes it a lesser value product. And I wish we could do it also for affordable housing permanently. But we are dependent on national legislation.
We don't have the social housing for forever. It's the same.
Yes, that's a problem. After 30, 40 years, they ran out of the social binding, and we can't build the same amount new, which are falling out of this program. That's a problem. Yeah,
it definitely is. Masterplans. I think masterplans are a huge task because they try to predict the future. And I remember that at one point in Frankfurt, before the Riedberg and the Europaviertel was built, there was rather the fear of people leaving Frankfurt instead of moving into Frankfurt. I think that changed definitely in the last 20 years, which makes me a fossil of Frankfurt now. And this looking into a glass ball, into this magic ball, since you're all planners, or at least 3 of you are planners, do you sometimes have doubts about the development, or do you just how do you come to this feeling, okay, this is the best we can do the right way, or is there always the feeling we're not sure what we're doing? How do you go about it when you develop those plans?
Well, I would say no one is making such a plan alone. So you have many people working on it, many opinions, as I mentioned in my slides. What do you call it? Swarm intelligence? Mm-hmm. Maybe if many people work on something, the outcome may be a compromise, but maybe, it's not a bad compromise. The risks are lower to make false decisions if many people work together.
So how many departments? You had how many departments?
12 departments.
12 departments in Frankfurt created in all discussions and plans, the master plan. How many departments in Tel Aviv were busy with that?
How many?
Do you have departments?
We have regional departments in the city. So every region in the city, every department is in it, and there's the strategic department that actually leads it. And I think every part of the municipality takes part in it in a way. It's not only planning; it's also finance and the property of the city and legal department. It's like it really covers the whole municipality. But the people who actually lead it, it's I don't know, about 6, I guess, or 8 departments. And I think about the compromise. I think, you know, planning is a profession of compromise. I think this is the beauty of it. And it's not something, you know, I'm happy when I see it happen, because it let a lot of interests find themselves within the planning within the city.
When you started studying, did you imagine that your job is actually the compromise?
No, I thought I will be an artist.
I studied architecture. I had no idea, I would say.
Of course, we when I was studying, we had projects. We were working for 4 people, one area, and we had discussions all night long. Just 4 people. So already then it came apparent that you know, you can't do it can't do what you want.
I would just say an anecdote that when I was studying my second degree in Australia, and it's such a huge country, and I was working in an office that also did urban planning, and there's so much free space that you actually don't really have to compromise about anything. You just throw the houses just in the wherever they land. There's so much space, and I think it's. For me, it was a bit boring, because when you have to, you don't have conflict, and the conflicts are really the interesting thing about it.
Yeah, the conflicts give you orientation. It's nothing worse than planning on a white piece of paper with no edges, no conflicts. Then it's hard to have ideas then.
True. How's it with the high-rise plan? The same?
Well, over the last years, the high-rise plans, they were all focused on places, more on spatial things. But I think that's a bit a thing of the past. Like a lot of these very spatial plans, they're very static, and so I think in the future, we are not we can't predict what's going to happen, and things are happening more quickly, and so that's why we need to have flexibility in these plans. So I will just say that probably in a way a master plan is something like a dinosaur, which is not what we can use in the future, because we need to change more quickly. We need to adapt more quickly to things, and like you're doing an update of the master plan, and it's a couple of years ago since we started with our master plan, and now we are thinking, or we are seeing that things develop in another way, and so. We're still growing, but well.
How do you build in flexibility into master plans?
So it's more like a set of rules, probably what we need these days.
Yeah, what you need is evaluation. Every few years we do that. Every few years we're looking at the plan. Well, what have we done? What is the development? So you discuss the plan every few years through that. It's not just somewhere on the shelf. Pops up every few years for evaluation.
So it's similar to your update, probably.
Yeah, I guess it's a continuous cycle.
Yeah, because without the flexibility, you can't do the master plans, because then they would be dinosaurs. I mean, I remember this idea of the finger plan of the skyscrapers in Frankfurt, which now feels very much like a dinosaur compared to the way we're going now. But on the other hand, the idea of the high rises along the Wallanlagen works pretty well, I have to say, for Frankfurt. And I think one important conclusion would be, like Aldo Rossi built the building, saying he picked up on the local traditions.
Yeah, on history and context, and materials, and but pretty much on history and context. And I think it's
still valid.
Yeah,
no, I think it's still valid to take the essence of what the place, location, the city is, to be able to adjust to that. I mean, rebuilding urban renewal from 4 floors to 8 to 20. I think Frankfurt is a bit far from that jump yet. What do you think?
Because it has open spaces that it can depend on that.
Yeah, well, the citizens here may see that a bit different, you know. But they're used to this, so I think we have the same discussions and conflicts, maybe on another dimension. Yes.
Okay, we would have a microphone, a hand microphone, if anybody here in the public would like to raise an issue or question to our wonderful experts here, we can do that. There is one. Okay. Can you get the microphone? Thank you.
Thank you. I have the question, I really like master plans, but on the other side, there's always the question of power. So who introduces what the master plans, or who implements what master plans are planning? I'm referring on housing, because all these master plans have the question of how can we develop housing for the people? What's the need of the people? When we discuss how many homes we need in the next decades, I guess in the next 5 or 10 years, as much as can be built, again, it's not enough because of the consumption of space is so big. And because who creates housing is a big issue. So you are talking of I looked it up, construction land resolution, maybe. So one of the major aspects here is that now non-for-profit housing will be built. And this is the third column of how housing can be produced. We have the for-profit housing, and it will always be way too expensive. And then we have public housing, which decreases after 20 years. Yeah, that's normal. But we need more of the non-for-profit housing. And as good as master plans are, they don't discuss who is building and who is earning from construction. And I guess now we have the new legislation, hopefully, of non-for-profit housing again. After 1990, it got lost. And I would say this would be, I'm also referring on the 20s or the 70s, there was nearly enough housing built. Yeah, and it is always the question, who is building it? Is it for profit or is it non-for-profit? And how much of the space will per person be consumed? And who is consuming housing and who is consuming free space? It's always a question of the needs of the people. And then in the end, just one thought. I really like the idea that you are reducing mobility, the space for cars, because one of the very important things is that we need to support sustainable lifestyles. People who are living sustainably should benefit from the city, and those who don't do that should not benefit from the city. So this is, people have to be supported when they are performing sustainable lifestyles. So a lot of things, but I think it was so interesting what you all said. So I was like, oh, I want to comment that. So maybe you have some ideas on that.
Okay, I can say just that Tel Aviv was always depending on private entrepreneurs for building. I think they do it much more efficiently and much quicker than what the city or the government could do it. Although in the 50s, with the big immigrants waves that came to Israel, actually the government built very quickly many housing. Weren't in good quality, and this housing is what we demolish now. The house is actually deteriorating after 50 years. So most of the buildings are built and planned by private initiatives. Although the regulation, there's always regulation, and the city and the government regulate the rules. So it's not only for profit, but of course some of it it has to be profitable, and we try to implement as much. To address as much public and social issues, but not damaging the feasibility, the financial feasibility of projects. So there is always a conflict between the social issues which are not beneficial and private entrepreneur issues, which has to be beneficial. We try to make a balance.
So similar in here, private entrepreneurship is very important, produces most of the housing. What I like to add is, I think in the 90s, Frankfurt sold a lot of properties which was owned by the city. They sold it to make money, and today we regret that. I would say we shouldn't sell any piece of land anymore. Instead, we should, if we have the chance to buy land before it's getting expensive and it's getting developed, we should take the chance and regain the power over the over the land.
How is it in Tel Aviv? Is the land city land, state land, or all privatized?
In Israel, in general, most of the land owned by the country. In Tel Aviv, today, most of the land is private. Some of it belongs to the city. And the city actually, most of the time, doesn't sell it. It leases it for 100 years or so, but it keeps it under its own
ownership.
Ownership.
How's it in Milan? You know?
It is mostly private with mostly private. There is a very big property that is of Pier Albergo Trivulzio, that is I think nearly a third of Milan and land outside Milan, that were donation to the church from prominent, persons, and also a lot of people who created companies that were that grew up in orphanage of these religious. And this is, I always think about this Pio Albergo Trivulzio properties because it's really in the center of Milan and it's like huge. But yeah, most of all is private anyway.
Okay, let's hope that the master plans we all drew up or are drawing up or are planning to change and adapt will give us a good future for green, for people, for all the other needs. And I say we're finished for today, but we will be back on the 6th of July on housing and resiliency, which has a lot to do with green and free space in between. At least that's what we're planning. And I hope you will all be back. Maybe not today here, but online. And of course, we will manage to stay on YouTube, and everybody who hasn't seen it can see it at a later point in time. So recommend it if you thought it interesting. I think I did. And thank you very much for coming. Thank you very much for coming here, and thank you for watching. And we will be back on Thursday, 6th of July at 7 p.m. German time. Thank you very much, and goodbye.